Hi, everyone. Welcome. Before I begin, I would like to thank the staff of the Bildner Center, Karen Small, its managing director, and Jenny Gurman, senior department and center administrator, for all of their extraordinary work to keep the center going during the COVID-19 crisis, and for being here today on the webinar to make sure it runs smoothly. Note that I will refer to Lucy Dawidowicz throughout this lecture by Dawidowicz, her last name, and by Lucy, her first name, but not by her maiden name, Lucy or Liebe Schildkret, because even though there are some anachronistic moments, it would just get, I think, too confusing in this webinar form to keep track of all her different names. From left to right, Lucy Dawidowicz, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History, is a biography, but it is not a classical biography. It is not a deep dive into the interior life of a figure, nor is it a detailed study of her literary and historical works, and nor is it, an excruciatingly detailed analysis of her political journey, although all of those components are in the book. Rather, this book is a life study that illuminates the major issues of modern Jewish life, particularly refracted through the American diaspora. And it connects the European Jewish past to the post-war period in the United States. The book is written in 4 parts, and you can see them here on this slide. And these 4 parts move between New York City and Europe. And the movement echoes Lucy Dawidowicz's transnational identity as an American Jewish immigrant daughter committed to an East European diaspora nationalist vision of Jewish peoplehood. Diaspora nationalism was an ideological movement born in 19th century Eastern Europe that posited that the Jews were first and foremost a people who shaped a culture, religion, and civilization that sustained them in their long years of exile. The 1,000-year-old Yiddish language represented the cultural distinctiveness of the Jews of Eastern Europe and was considered by many diaspora nationalists to be an essential component of modern Jewish identity. And this ideology profoundly shaped Lucy Dawidowicz. In today's lecture, I'm going to walk you through the book in a schematic way to give you a sense of how her life illuminated the major issues confronting modern East European Jewry, both in the European heartland and in the diaspora. And many of these questions also obtain for life in the modern state of Israel, but I won't treat that here. And it is important to recall that New York City was the largest settlement of Jews of East European origin throughout the 20th century, much of the 20th century. Through Dawidowicz's life, I addressed the following questions. What is the relationship of self-consciously modern Jews to Judaism, the Jewish religious tradition? How can a modern Jew balance individualism versus belonging to a group? In other words, what place does Jewish peoplehood, often referred to as Jewish nationalism with a lowercase n, have in post-war Jewish life? What role does the commemoration of the Holocaust play or should play in shaping modern Jewish life? And a subset of that question is, how should the causes of the final solution be understood as they relate to the tensions between the singularity and universality of the Holocaust? Finally, what should be the relationship of Jews and their leaders to the politics of the host country? Now, Dawidowicz's Americanness informed an additional set of very specific questions. What was and should be the relationship of Jews to modern political liberalism and to the Democratic Party? What are the limits of liberal American Jews' defense of the absolute separation of church and state? How did and should American Jews respond to the new social and political movements of the late 1960s forward, such as civil rights, feminism, and Jewish religious renewal? What was the role of Jewish intellectuals during the post-war years, a period in which a strong integrationist ethos predominated in addressing the dilemmas of modern Jewish history? And what role should the American diaspora play in support of Israel and its political leadership and policies? These issues took on a heightened urgency in the mid-20th century when the initial thrust of acculturation on the part of the immigrant generation was over, and new generations of American Jews of East European origin had to construct new forms of Jewish identity, and they sought to feel secure in their diaspora. And I would argue that these questions are still very much the questions of modern Jewish existence in the diaspora. In addressing these questions, my book put Lucy S. Dawidowicz's life in conversation with a group of well-known immigrant sons, the so-called New York intellectuals. Individuals like, and we're waiting for their pictures, Lionel Trilling, Irving Howe, Alfred Kazin, Irving Kristol, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, and Norman Podhoretz, among others. Here they are. Born in 1915, Lucy's life paralleled theirs. Like them, she was a youthful leftist, became an ardent Roosevelt Democrat in the 1930s, and then in the late 1960s and early 1970s, she moved to identify with neoconservatism. She evolved politically, as the title of my book states, from left to right, as many of the New York intellectuals did. However, not all of them did. Moreover, she had personal friendships with several of them, yet she was different from them. Why are there shelves of books about the New York intellectuals and almost no work on her? My book is the first major study of Dawidowicz. Was it her sex, her unapologetic commitment to Jewish particularism, her amateur status, she lacked a PhD, her East Europeanness, her assertive temperament, or all of the above that led to the lack of recognition? I wrote from left to right in order to place Lucy Dawidowicz's life in explicit historical comparison with these famous men, and to ask what made her political journey distinctive from theirs. And in so doing, I sought to shed light on a political tradition of Jewish conservatism that has been slighted in the historiography, just as her life has been slighted. My book claims that Dawidowicz's difference resided in the fact that she encountered American modernity from solid Jewish cultural and linguistic ground, with a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people. Educated at diaspora nationalist institutions, such as the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute and the Yiddish Scientific Institute, now known by its acronym, the YIVO, which represented a vast transnational Jewish diasporic Yiddish-speaking world, Dawidowicz regularly wrote in Yiddish, and her later scholarly and popular writings, written in English, had a distinctive Jewish audience in mind, even as they spoke to a broader, general American audience. Where the male New York intellectuals saw their political commitments and transformations in American terms, Dawidowicz framed hers in relationship to the long Jewish past and to East European Jewish history and politics. Responding to the cultural challenge and political challenges of the post-war years, she looked to lessons, or at least typologies, of the long Jewish past. And she interpreted American Jewish communal needs within the parameters of diasporic Jewish politics. She made two fateful trips to Europe in her early adulthood, the first to Poland in 1938, and the second to post-war occupied Germany in 1947. This direct contact with anti-Semitism in interwar Poland, her work with Jewish refugees in post-war Germany, and her personal ties to individuals who had experienced the Soviet encroachment upon Eastern Europe permanently informed her critique of the New York intellectuals' liberal cosmopolitanism, which she ultimately came to regard as assimilationist and hostile to Jewish particularism and continuity. That is, she absorbed the European experience of Jewishness. In part one of my book, In New York City in the Interwar Years, I tell the story of Lucy's immigrant childhood. Here's our slide coming up slowly. This chapter, American Immigrant Daughter, tells the story of her childhood, adolescence, and college years. The chapter claims that she inhabited two worlds simultaneously, that of the American urban landscape in interwar New York, and that of East European Jewish society with all its social, cultural, linguistic, political, and cultural components. She lived in a very Jewish society that in many ways resembled that of the urban settlements of East Europe. Participated in American institutions, the public elementary school, middle school, and high school, the college, and also the library system. And of course, she listened to American music and was absorbed American culture. She attended the prestigious Hunter College High School for Girls and Hunter College itself, a women's public college in New York City in the politically intense 1930s. At Hunter, she pursued a degree in English, and in 1934, she joined the staff of Echo, the college's literary magazine. She wrote short stories, book reviews, she did translations, and she also wrote her own verse. By 1935, she had become editor-in-chief of Echo, and she was also a member of the Young Communist League, and she took the magazine's editorial policy leftward. And you can see this very clearly in November 1935 issue in its blaring red cover. But also note on the right side of the slide, her very American yearbook graduation photograph. The chapter also anchors Lucy in Yiddishism and Jewish secularism, and in an understanding of that untranslatable phrase, Yiddishkeit, which is often rendered as Jewishness. And this phrase and its meaning would undergo revision as she matured. Her hyphenated identity informed everything about her life. Besides attending the Shalom Aleichem Folk Institute's Yiddish schools, Lucy attended Camp Boibelik. And I'll bring another slide up, waiting for it. On the left, you see the brochure of Camp Boibelik. Boibelik was a summer camp, a Yiddish summer camp, and it created a European environment in the United States where Jewishness, the Yiddish language, and the concept of a Jewish people were seamlessly interwoven. The brochure says in Yiddish that the camp was for children from the progressive Jewish home. That's who attended. And the letter on the right side of the slide is from Lucy to her dear friend Evelyn Konoff, and it illustrates her two commitments in the mid-1930s, to Yiddish and to communism. And you see the part that I translated. The typewriter comes from the Communist Party, and then in red ribbon, it says, "Down with the capitalist system, long live the Soviet Union." In 1936, Lucy was shocked by the merciless cruelty and political hypocrisy of the Moscow trials, and she left the Young Communist League and never looked back. She remained, however, devoted to Yiddish culture. Where the male New York intellectuals had alienation and cosmopolitan their worldviews, Lucy had Yiddishkeit, an intuitive, holistic sense of belonging to the Jewish people, which set the stage for her remarkable decision to go to Poland in August 1938. Part 2 of the book, In Poland, Refugee, New York City, and Germany, I narrate her formative European years in Vilna, Poland, in New York City from 1940 to 1946, where she worked in the European-like world of the New York YIVO with its immigrant and refugee scholars, and in Germany from September 1946 to December 1947. During those years, she acquired an East European Jewish soul, an identity that came to shape her representation of Polish Jewish civilization and culture after the war. Chapter 2 of the book, An American in Vilna, I'm again waiting for the slide, It explores Dawidowicz's momentous year as a graduate fellow at the YIVO's Aspirantur, a research fellowship program, where she came under the wings of Max Weinreich, YIVO's director, and Zelig Kalmanovich, a YIVO activist who became a surrogate father figure to her. Vilna was a city with a mythical rabbinic past, but it also symbolically represented Yiddishism and secularism for Dawidowicz. In Vilna, she became even more deeply rooted in diaspora nationalism, and she met many of the luminaries of secular Yiddish culture, including the historian Elias Cherikover and the poets Chaim Grada and Avram Sutzever, among many others. At the same time, she began to wrestle with the challenge of trying to ground a modern Jewish identity in Yiddish secularism. This slide shows you the world of the Vilna YIVO. At the bottom is the cohort, the fourth cohort of the Aspirantur, the students and their teachers, and Lucy is standing right here. To the left, you have the list of research topics in Yiddish of the fourth cohort, and Lucy's topic for her research was the Yiddish press in England. And in the upper right, you see her sitting really beautifully at the YIVO Vilna in this momentous year. Now, this year ended abruptly when the Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed, and Lucy had to flee Vilna. But it is also important to realize that even then, in this year, she had become to be very suspicious of the incompatibility of universalist ideologies with Jewish survival. And it brought into sharp relief for her the problem of the association of Jews and the left, because the myth of Jiddo Kommuna was alive and well. It was part of Hitler's ideology, which she heard, of course, in the late 1930s. And in Vilna in this year, she also was introduced rather painfully to street hooliganism that was perpetrated by students as well as just general thugs, if you will. So the anti-Semitism of interwar Polish students and the universities challenged that education would conquer ethnic intolerance. These things were already brewing in her, these issues, before her flight in late August 1939 from Poland via Nazi Germany and back to New York from Copenhagen. Chapter 3 of the book then tells the story of what it was like, and again, the slide is taking its time, what it was like for her to work both in New York City, the New York Vilna, and also what it was like in the DP camps in the American British zones of occupied post-war Germany. First of all, the war years, 40 to 46. Lucy worked at the Vilna YIVO, also escaped Europe. And this was an incredibly intense period where there were refugees coming from Europe, like Weinreich himself, who worked at the YIVO. So she was surrounded by European Jews. All of them were racked by worry and guilt about their family and their friends back in Europe. She and Weinreich labored to keep the New York Vilna alive and to keep the vision of diaspora nationalism vital. And Weinreich's efforts to secure the YIVO's future became increasingly urgent when remnants of the YIVOs and other Vilna Jewish libraries were discovered in a book depository in Germany in 1945. Pushed by tensions at the YIVO and personal tensions with Weinreich and pulled by guilt and restiveness, Lucy once again set out for Europe in 1946. And chapter 4 of the book tells what it was like to work in the American and British zones of occupation. She encountered Europe in the land of Amalek. That's how she referred to it in her memoir. Amalek being the Israelites' implacable enemy. As an educational officer for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, Lucy worked for 15 months in post-war Germany, and she worked with an international group of Jews who worked on behalf of the DPs from all over Europe. And in the center of this slide, you see one of the products of her work with the DPs. There she came into contact with survivors. Several of them were Polish Jewish historians who pioneered the first stages of Holocaust research, which they called in Yiddish Grobenforschung, the research on destruction. She was instrumental in securing the Yiddish linotype for the journal Von letzten Groben, Zeitschrift für Geschichte von jüdischen Leben based on Nazi regime. And this is the front cover of that journal. And it reached Yiddish readers in Palestine, Western Europe, the Americas, and in the DP camps themselves. And this activity, Lucy Dawidowicz's later work as an historian of the Holocaust from the Jewish perspective, and with her role as a translator of that experience for the Anglo-Jewish and American publics. Two other major historical events place Lucy at the heart of the complexities of the post-war period. The first was the restitution of Jewish cultural property, and the second was the experience of the Jewish refugees from the ship, the Exodus 1947, when they were reinterned in post-war Germany. And you can see on the right side of the slide a photograph of the arrival of 420 cases of books and library material from the book depository in Germany to New York as part of the restitution process. And they arrived in 1947. Instrumental in cataloging the books, and she was there when they left Europe. This bolstered her American patriotism because it was the US military government and the Library of Congress, through Weinreich's intercession, that got the books from Europe to New York. They provided the means of transportation. And the second event, the reinternment of the Jews from the Exodus, you can see here in this slide a figure of the medical staff at the Poppenhof DB camp. And Lucy became beloved friends with the doctor, Dr. Pearl Ketcher. And she was there when the Exodus refugees were disembarked, where she met Pearl. And Pearl becomes a central figure for her, a beloved friend, a correspondent of over 40 years. And after the war, Pearl immigrated to Israel, and her home on Marcus Street in Jerusalem became a symbolic home in the Jewish state for Lucy. Part 3 of my book, Becoming an American, which sounds a little ironic, but here I detail what it was like, and again, the slide is coming up slowly, when Lucy returned to New York in December 1947. She married Shimon Davidovich 3 weeks later, which is where she gets her Polish name, and to work for the American Jewish Committee. So she truly becomes an American, even as Polish Jewish life and civilization remain inscribed in her heart. In the years, 2 decades at the American Jewish Committee, she worked on these topics that you see outlined on the slide. She worked on issues of church-state separation, which of course directly addressed the issue of secularization. She worked on what was then called Negro-Jewish relations, and she worked on anti-communism. And so she researched all of these topics: Soviet anti-Semitism, communism, Holocaust denial, and neo-Nazism, the role of religion in American Jewish life and politics, and, as I said, Negro-Jewish relations. A good way to understand that is, what is the relationship of Jews to allies and other minorities in American culture and society? She was central to the committee's efforts to construct Cold War liberalism. And like many Jews of the period, she viewed liberalism and Jewishness as natural bedfellows. But the chapter ends as that symbiosis begins to fray. So working at the committee tested her liberal commitment to civil rights. Now privy to kind of insider status and insider Jewish politics, she found herself increasingly concerned with the radicalization of the civil rights movement and the rise of what the New York intellectual Lionel Trilling called the adversary politics and the adversary culture of the new left and the counterculture, which he believed, as did many, that it threatened American civil society. She produced memos on the urban crisis, on inner city violence, and on Black anti-Semitism. And I argue that she anticipated by a decade the developments that created the initial rift between African Americans and Jews. And obviously in today's moment, we're thinking about this very much. These developments included Black nationalism's identification with post-colonialism and anti-Zionism, the conflicting economic roles of urban Jews and Blacks, and the crisis in the public schools that had supported Jewish integration but failed the Black urban poor. Now, while at the committee to write many book reviews and articles for Commentary magazine, and also to publish her first book on East European Jewish life, The Golden Tradition, Jewish Life and Thought in Eastern Europe. The Golden Tradition is an anthology of first-person primary sources by East European Jewish writers, literally translated from Yiddish, Russian, Polish, and Hebrew, and figuratively translates the civilization of East European Jews for an English reading and speaking audience. Its form illustrates her commitment to narrating Jewish history from Jewish sources. The Golden Tradition earned her instant acclaim as an expert on Jewish life in Eastern Europe, and the book accelerated the post-war interest in the East European Jewish past among American Jews, even as and his wife Riva Kalmanovich coded it as a literary response to the Holocaust. Lucy hoped that the vitality of the sources representing a diversity and majesty of the East European Jewish past would help to counter assimilationist trends among post-war American Jews. The book certainly succeeded in making the New York Jewish intellectuals take note. Figures like Alfred Kazin and Irving Howe reviewed the book and wrote to her about the book as they assess their relationship to East European Jewish culture. The Golden Tradition also became her ticket to a new career as a full-time scholar and teacher. She left the American Jewish Committee in 1969 and became part of the faculty of Stern College for Women of Yeshiva University. There, she was tasked with teaching the Holocaust, and she encountered a lack of bibliography on the subject in English. The next slide shows you, here it comes, I hope. Still waiting for it. There we go. The first page of her Holocaust seminar syllabus, which she started to produce, you can see typewritten, in March of 1969. What you can't see, I think, because of your screen, is that this section here, antecedents and antecedents, says from Mein Kampf to the Wannsee Conference. And you can see here that she is already noting her views of the origins of the final solution, right? She's dating it to the publication of Mein Kampf in 1925. This is an early dating in today's historiography, but it represents, again, her perspective, which is called an intentionalist perspective. Now, there wasn't a book in print in those years that presented not only the German assault on the Jews, what is known as perpetrator history, but also the Jews' response to it. In 1970, Yeshiva University received funds to support research and teaching on the Holocaust, and Dawidowicz was appointed the university's Leah and Paul Paul Lewis Professor of Holocaust Studies, the first chair in an American university devoted to the study of the catastrophe. She held the position for 5 years, during which time she wrote The War Against the Jews, 1933 to 1945. Published in 1975, the book was a popular synthetic history both of Nazi anti-Semitism, with its culmination in the final solution, and the Jewish response to it. Here you see the original cover of the book. I argue that this book was a direct response to Hannah Arendt's damning image of a complicit Jewish leadership in the destruction of the Jews in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, and to Raoul Hilberg's image of East European Jewry as politically passive. In contrast, The War Against the Jews emphasized the Jewish experience of the Holocaust, stressing what today we would call communal resilience. She hoped the book would underscore the magnitude of the destruction of the European Jewish heartland, yet commemorate East European Jewry's vitality in order to create a viable model for post-Holocaust American Jews, the assimilated, integrated grandchildren, of the immigrant generation. These two major books, The Golden Tradition and The War Against the Jews, written for a post-war public primed to begin absorbing the trauma of the Holocaust, made Dawidowicz an influential Jewish public intellectual. The last part of my book, Eastern Europe in America, exposes the fissure between Dawidowicz's European-inflected diaspora nationalist modern Jewish identity and the shifting definition of American liberalism from the late 1960s forward, which informed her identification with neoconservatism. Beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Dawidowicz became part of what would coalesce into a group of Jewish New York intellectuals who moved rightward politically. These nascent neoconservatives were shocked by the political tactics and goals of the militant civil rights movement and of the New Left and of the counterculture, which struck them as unnecessarily confrontational as well as careless in their disregard for the hard-won liberal values that safeguarded American democracy and which had allowed American Jewish immigrants a successful pathway to integration. When the New Left and African-American activists championed the cause of militant radicals such as the Sandinistas and included the Palestinians, many Jewish intellectuals felt threatened as Jews. Dawidowicz shared these fears, but I argue that her turn to neoconservatism derived first and foremost from her transnational Jewish commitments, her interpretations of Jewish history, and her anxiety about Jewish survival. The urban riots of the 1960s, with their implication of Jewish economic exploitation as their root cause, a leitmotif of European anti-Semitic populism, filled her with an ominous sense of déjà vu. She reacted to the social and political crises of the late 1960s and 1970s as an East European Jew, even as she lived in America. Her evolving political conservatism was out of sync with many American Jews, but I argue from Jewish political behavior in an essential way. Her reading of Jewish history led Dawidowicz to embrace political quiescence or mainstream politics as a dominant strain of Jewish political behavior in the pre-modern period, and one that was embedded in Jewish religious tradition. Working at the committee had changed her view of what constituted effective political strategy. Behind-the-scenes diplomacy, she now argued, was more productive than street protest and demonstrations, and it had a venerable Jewish historical pedigree. One of her models was Louis Marshall, the president of the committee in the early years, a kind of Brahmin Jewish statesman about whom she had written a master's essay in the early 1960s. Dawidowicz's conservatism was also directly linked to her commitment to an intentionalist interpretation of the Holocaust that emphasized the unprecedented nature of the assault on European Jewish civilization during World War II, which she argued was inextricably related to Hitler's ideological anti-Semitism, which she dated, as I noted earlier, to his Mein Kampf. She rejected the functionalist approach to the Holocaust and the new left historians' focus on historical structures and social class to understand the Germans' war against the Jews. Dawidowicz's historical views on the final solution were not necessarily shared by her scholarly peers. Although she was asked to serve on the President's Commission on the Holocaust in 1978, she insisted that the Holocaust Memorial emphasize anti-Semitism's role in the unique, murderous Nazi campaign against the Jews, and that it underscore their successful annihilation of the Jews' millennial culture and civilization in Europe. And this insistence put her at odds with predominant Universalist positions on the commission, and she soon resigned from it. In 1984, Dawidowicz formally crossed the aisle from the Democratic to the Republican Party. At the prestigious The State of World Jewry address given in front of a packed New York audience, she sounded the alarm that the threat to Jewish existence came not from historic Jewish enemies like the church, but from the Soviet Union, its political subordinates in the Third World, their anti-Zionist spokesman in the UN, and from student radicals. She urged her audience to vote for Ronald Reagan and to abandon the Democratic Party, which she no longer felt represented Jewish interest. And these views illustrate that her Jewish culture war was now firmly entangled with the American culture wars. In the late 1980s, Dawidowicz was politically beleaguered, lonely, and stuck in her inability to complete a long-planned history of the Jews in the United States. As a response, she turned back to the ideals of Jewish Eastern Europe as inspiration for post-war American Jewish life. In 1989, she published From That Place and Time, her 1938 to 1947, a memoir. And it was a memento mori for Yiddishkeit and the Yiddish language. This is the cover of my reissue of the book in 2008 with Rutgers University Press. And it has an introduction, my introduction to Lucy's original book. While writing this memoir, Lucy founded and almost single-handedly raised money for the Fund for the Translation of Jewish Literature, a nonprofit translation of Jewish and Yiddish classics for the American public. And you can see on this slide that's coming up, the newly translated and issued Glickel Memoirs, 1691 to 1719. And you can see on the right slide that without the monies and support from the Fund for the Translation of Jewish Literature, this book would not have been published. And so this is her legacy, is the Fund for the Translation of Jewish Literature. Literature, particularly Yiddish literature, provided solace for Dawidowicz amid turbulent times and existential loneliness. To conclude, I believe the best way to understand Lucy S. Dawidowicz's rightward political journey is to go back to her roots in diaspora nationalist Yiddish culture and its commitment to Jewish group survival. This was her wellspring. Dawidowicz never retreated from her diaspora nationalist commitments, never apologized for her Jewish allegiance, and never shied away from her advocacy of Jewish distinctiveness. Though Dawidowicz's right-wing politics, her sex, and her unapologetic commitment to Jewish particularism have resulted in scholarly neglect, my book's argument is that her life makes visible the relationship of post-war American Jewish political conservatism to the Jews' long history, a history shaped in Europe, the Jewish diasporic heartland. At the time of her death, and still today, she died in 1990, the majority of American Jews had not heeded Dawidowicz's call for a political realignment with the Republican Party. Yet she anticipated the deepening fracture between American Jews as well as their Israeli Jewish compatriots who consider liberalism to be a Jewish value and those who do not. The polarization, some call it a Jewish civil war, between liberal integrationists on the left and conservative particularists on the right has increased enormously in the past 25 years. As the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox population of Jews has continued to grow, becoming a larger percentage of the American and Israeli Jewish demographic with greater political power, so has the tension between Jews and the liberal institutions of society. If in the 1980s, Dawidowicz miscalculated American Jewish political inclinations, we do well to remember her prescience, insisting that the hallowed American Jewish liberal tradition was historically contingent. Lucy Dawidowicz anticipated many of today's political polarities and cultural challenges. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, and I look forward to addressing your questions.